It is a trade so lopsided, so utterly insane, that it should have been a joke. Take it, the Dutchman whispers. Take the swampy island of Manhattan. Take the muddy outposts of the New Netherlands. Just give us run. To the British, it felt like a heist. They were getting a vast gateway to a continent in exchange for a tiny, jagged rock in the middle of the Banda Sea.
London, 1603. The air doesn't just smell bad, it suffocates. It is a thick, cloying stench of rotting offal, open sewers, and the sweet, sickly aroma of the dying. The Black Death has returned to the city, and it is no longer a distant memory, it is a neighbor. When the plague bell tolls, it is the sound of a rhythmic executioner. One day you are a healthy merchant. The next, your lungs are filling with fluid, and your skin is erupting in black, painful buboes the size of apples. In this vacuum of hope, the people of London will believe in anything. They press dead pigeons to their sores, they drink liquid gold, and they pray until their knees bleed. But then, a rumor spreads from the royal courts down to the muddy gutters. A miracle shield exists. It is a wrinkled brown seed from the other side of the world. They call it nutmeg. To the 17th century mind, nutmeg was more than a spice. It was biological armor. Physicians, dressed in their terrifying bird-beaked masks, claimed that nutmeg's warm and dry nature could repel the cold and damp poison of the plague. The wealthy wore these seeds in ornate silver lockets around their necks, sniffing them like a drug to ward off the miasma rising from the mass graves. This wasn't just medicine, it was a status symbol of the highest order. In the markets of Cheapside, a single pound of nutmeg cost more than a small house's rent for an entire year. The profit margin was a staggering 0% from its point of origin. But there was a massive problem. Nobody in Europe actually knew where it came from. For centuries, the source was a secret guarded by Arab traders and Venetian middlemen who told tales of islands guarded by griffins and vanished in the mist. But the age of fairy tales was dying, replaced by the age of the company. In 1602, the Dutch launched the world's first mega corporation, the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company. It was a revolutionary and terrifying entity, a company with its own army, its own navy, and the legal power to execute anyone who stood in the way of its profit margins. It was a state with a stock ticker. At its heart was Pieterszoon Coen, a cold-blooded accountant who saw the world not as a creation of God, but as a giant ledger to be balanced. To Coen, the indigenous Bandanese people were not trading partners. They were merely a line item to be erased in favor of a total global monopoly. Across the English Channel, the English East India Company watched with growing envy. They were scrappy, underfunded, and desperate. They chose a man named Nathaniel Courthope, a stubborn and gritty sea dog who believed in national honor over corporate accounting. While Coen built a machine of war, Courthope prepared for a gamble of survival. The race was now on for the Banda Islands, the only place on Earth where the golden nut grew. Neither man knew it yet, but their bitter rivalry would eventually lead to a desperate trade that changed the map of the world forever. An exchange of a tiny, blood-soaked spice island for a swampy, forgotten outpost called Manhattan. When Pieterszoon Coen stepped onto the Banda Islands, he carried no sword, only a ledger. He was a bureaucrat of ink and stiff collars, a man who looked at the lush volcanic soil and saw only a market inefficiency. To his mathematical mind, the free trade practiced by the Bandanese was a sin against profit. He didn't come to haggle, he came to impose the will of the VOC, the clockwork Kraken. This wasn't just a company, it was a predator with a stock ticker, and Coen was its brain. He constructed Fort Belgica, a massive stone star that loomed over the islands. Its guns were pointed not at invading fleets, but directly at the Bandanese villages below. It was an architectural threat. Produce for us, or perish. Coen demanded a total monopoly, requiring the Orang Kaya, the local elders, to sign away their rights to sell to anyone else. To the Bandanese, who had traded with the world for centuries, this was absurd. They argued that the trees belonged to God. To Coen, this was a breach of contract. The Cold War of the spice trade turned red in 1609. Admiral Peter Verhoeven, believing his status made him untouchable, went to negotiate under a large tree. He was ambushed and slaughtered by the Bandanese, who were pushed to the brink of desperation. When news reached Coen, he didn't mourn the dead. He smiled. In his ledger, he now had a legal justification for total war. He rebranded the entire indigenous population as murderous treaty breakers. The accountant had finally found his excuse to erase an entire people from the map. The era of trade was over. The era of the Crimson Harvest had begun. 1621 was the year the VOC stopped being a company and became a butcher. Pieterszoon Coen had returned to the Banda Islands with a force built for annihilation. 600 Dutch soldiers and 80 Japanese Ronin samurai mercenaries, hired specifically for their cold efficiency in execution. Coen didn't want a deal. He wanted a clean ledger. The campaign was a systematic operation of terror. Dutch forces moved island by island, burning villages and uprooting anyone who resisted. The Bandanese fled to the volcanic cliffs of Lontour, hoping the terrain would save them, but Coen's logic was relentless. He knew he didn't need to kill every person in the forest. He just needed to decapitate the soul of the resistance. He rounded up the 44 most influential Orang Kaya, the elders who had led the islands for generations. Under the shadow of Fort Belgica, in front of their weeping families, he handed them over to the Japanese mercenaries. In a matter of minutes, the traditional leadership of the Banda Islands was executed. Their heads were placed on bamboo spikes as a terrifying warning to any who survived. This was corporate restructuring written in blood, performed with the mechanical indifference of an audit. The numbers that follow are the coldest part of the story. Before 1621, the population of the Bandas was roughly 15,000 people. By the time Coen was finished, only 600 remained. Thousands were slaughtered, thousands more starved on the cliffs, and the rest were loaded onto ships to be sold into slavery. Coen stood on the silent soil and finally saw what he wanted: a total monopoly. He divided the islands into Perkin and handed them over to retired VOC employees, the Perkineers, who became the new plantation masters using imported slave labor. The golden nut was finally exclusively Dutch. But as Coen looked at his perfectly balanced books, he realized one tiny rock had escaped his grasp. On the horizon sat the island of Run, where a man named Nathaniel Courthope was still flying the English flag, preparing to make the Kraken's victory very, very expensive. While Pieterszoon Coen was turning the rest of the Bandas into a silent, corporate cemetery, a tiny, jagged rock called Run became the most important piece of land on Earth. Run was barely 2 miles long, possessed no fresh water, and had no natural harbor. To any sane sailor, it was a death trap. But for Nathaniel Courthope, it was the front line of an empire. In 1616, Courthope arrived with 2 leaky ships and a handful of men. He didn't have Coen's cannons or his mercenaries, but he had something the Dutch couldn't understand: a relentless, stubborn sense of national honor. He persuaded the local Bandanese to formally cede their island to King James I. Suddenly, this muddy rock was the very first overseas colony of the British Empire. When the massive Dutch fleet arrived to seize it, Courthope didn't flinch. For the next 4 years, Courthope and his men lived in absolute misery. Surrounded by a permanent VOC blockade, they were effectively prisoners. They ran out of food and were forced to eat rats and lizards. They ran out of water and licked the morning dew off tropical leaves. Every time the Dutch sent a messenger offering a fortune in gold to surrender, Courthope's answer was the same. He would only leave on the direct orders of his king. Courthope was a ghost haunting Coen's perfect monopoly. Every day the English flag flew on run was a day the VOC didn't have 100% control over the global spice market. In 1620, desperate for supplies, Courthope tried to slip through the blockade in a small boat under the cover of a moonless night. He was spotted by a Dutch patrol. A single musket ball found its mark, and the King of Run vanished into the dark waves. Courthope died thinking he had failed for a spice he never even tasted in a kitchen, but his defiance created a legal claim that London refused to drop. He had planted a seed of conflict that eventually gave England the leverage to trade this rocky spice island for a place called Manhattan. With Nathaniel Courthope gone, the VOC finally had what Jan Pieterszoon Coen always wanted: a perfect, airtight monopoly. But the company soon faced a bizarre new crisis. They were too successful. The Spice Islands were producing so much nutmeg that the European market was becoming saturated. In the cold logic of the ledger, abundance was a disaster. If nutmeg became common, it would become cheap. And the VOC's massive military overhead, its forts, its armies, and its thousands of employees depended on the spice remaining an ultra-luxury. To solve this, the VOC turned to a strategy of extirpation. They began a systematic campaign of ecological destruction. They sent Hongi fleets, massive war, canoes filled with soldiers to every island in the archipelago. Their mission was not to plant, but to uproot and burn any nutmeg or clove tree that wasn't under direct Dutch guard. They were literally murdering the land to keep the prices high. In the warehouses of Amsterdam and Batavia, mountains of nutmeg and mace were piled high and set on fire. The air for miles smelled like the most expensive incense in history, while back in Europe, the poor still died of the plague, unable to afford the miracle cure. This was the birth of artificial scarcity. The VOC proved that a corporation could be more powerful than nature itself. By burning their own product, they ensured that a single handful of nutmeg continued to cost more than a man's life. But while the Dutch were busy manipulating the market, the English were nursing a deep, bitter grudge. The death of Courthope and the loss of Run hadn't been forgotten in London. The Spice War was no longer just a colonial skirmish. It was about to move to the cold waters of the English Channel. The tiny, muddy rock of Run was becoming the ultimate bargaining chip in a much larger game. By the mid-1660s, the simmering rivalry between England and the Netherlands exploded into the Second Anglo-Dutch War. This wasn't a war over borders or religion. It was a global struggle for the soul of trade. The Dutch VOC held an iron grip on the nutmeg of the bandas, but the English were looking for a way to break the Kraken's back. In 1664, an English fleet sailed into the harbor of a Dutch outpost called New Amsterdam. Governor Peter Stuyvesant was ready to fight to the last man, but the local settlers, exhausted by years of corporate mismanagement, refused to pick up their muskets for the company's sake. Without a single shot being fired, the colony fell and was promptly renamed New York. The Dutch response was a humiliation that still haunts British naval history. The legendary Admiral Michiel de Ruyter launched a daring raid on the River Thames, burning the English fleet at anchor and capturing their flagship, the Royal Charles. London was in a state of utter collapse. The bubonic plague was ravaging the streets, and the Great Fire had just turned the city to ash. Both nations were bleeding money and morale. In 1667, they sat down at the negotiating table in Breda to redraw the map. The Dutch held the military edge, but they only cared about one thing: the nutmeg monopoly. The central sticking point was the tiny island of Run. Even though Nathaniel Courthope was long dead, his ghost still held a legal claim to that rock. For the Dutch, this was an intolerable leak in their system. They offered a trade that seemed like a masterstroke of genius in 1667. England could keep the useless, swampy colony of Manhattan if they renounced all claims to run forever. The Dutch left the table laughing, convinced they had fleeced the English. They secured a total monopoly on the world's most profitable spice, never imagining that Manhattan would one day become the financial capital of the world. While run would fade into a forgotten footnote, the trade was done. The Kraken had its spice, and the English had a new world. For over a century, the VOC's monopoly was an iron cage. In the Banda Islands, stealing a single nutmeg seedling meant a slow, agonizing death. The Dutch had turned an entire archipelago into a high-security prison to keep the world's supply under their thumb. But the Kraken had one blind spot: a one-armed Frenchman named Pierre Poivre, a former priest turned horticulturalist. Poivre didn't see nutmeg as a corporate asset. He saw it as a prisoner of nature that needed to be liberated. In the mid-1700s, Poivre orchestrated one of the most daring acts of botanical espionage in history. He didn't use cannons or massive fleets. He used silence and stealth. Under the cover of tropical storms and moonless nights, he slipped past the Dutch Hongi fleets, the heavily armed war canoes that patrolled the Banda Sea with orders to kill any intruder on sight. Poivre and his team managed to infiltrate the forbidden spice forests, delicately uprooting live nutmeg and clove seedlings and hiding them in jars and wet rags. This was a death sentence if caught. Every Dutch fort they passed on the way out was a potential gallows. But Poivre made it. He successfully transplanted these stolen treasures to the French islands of Mauritius and Reunion. The Dutch monopoly, built on the blood of the Bandanese and maintained through terror for 150 years, didn't fall to a rival empire or a massive navy. It was destroyed by a gardener with a mission. As French nutmeg began to flood the global market, the artificial scarcity created by the VOC vanished. The golden nut was no longer gold. It was becoming a common kitchen ingredient. The VOC, once the richest and most terrifying corporation in human history, began a slow, inevitable slide into bankruptcy. The secret was out, the seeds were planted, and the era of the corporate gods was finally coming to an end. In 1799, the VOC, the mighty Kraken that had once ruled the oceans, finally collapsed under the weight of its own corruption and staggering debt. Its acronym was mockingly reinterpreted as perished under corruption. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British seized the Banda Islands and did exactly what the Dutch had feared for centuries. They transplanted nutmeg seedlings to every corner of their empire, from Singapore to Grenada. The monopoly was shattered. Nutmeg, the spice that had once launched 1,000 ships and cost thousands of lives, became just another common ingredient in the kitchen cupboard. The legacy of the spice war is etched into the very map of our modern world. In 1667, the Dutch thought they had committed the ultimate act of corporate genius by trading Manhattan for the tiny island of Run. Today, Manhattan is the glass and steel heart of global finance, a forest of skyscrapers built on the foundations of the very trade routes the VOC helped pioneer. Meanwhile, Run has returned to what it was before the madness, a quiet, isolated rock in the Banda Sea. There are no banks there, no empires, only the wind through the nutmeg trees and the sound of waves hitting the shore. The king of Run is long forgotten, and the Dutch forts are nothing but crumbling ruins being slowly reclaimed by the jungle. But the human cost was devastatingly real. The original Bandanese people were nearly erased from history just to keep a ledger balanced in Amsterdam. The madness of the 17th century proves that human greed can reshape the planet, turn swamps into cities, and turn paradises into graveyards. We use nutmeg today without a second thought, but every sprinkle carries the ghost of a world where a single nut was worth more than a human life. The trade is over. The ships have long since rotted away. But the world the spice built with all its beauty and all its blood is the one we still live in today.